Hello, Tim Amyx here. It's 2013 and 13 years ago, our family, the Amyx Gascon family, took a cross-country road trip and we made a video about that, the vacation video from 2010. But right now I'm going to show you a behind-the-scenes look at that video. Have some commentary, show some scenes that you didn't see in that actual edited version. So what did we do in 2010? We flew from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., had a car waiting for us there, our 2010 Toyota Prius, and then proceeded to drive down into Virginia, across to the Shenandoah National Park, up into Virginia and Maryland, to Gettysburg, Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia over through Delaware, up into New York City. From New York City, then we went up into Boston, Connecticut, Martha's Vineyard, Maine, Acadia National Park, looped across New Hampshire, Vermont, into upstate New York, went to Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, over to the Niagara Falls, up into Canada to Toronto, and then from Toronto came down through the edge of Detroit into Toledo, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Chicago, and from Chicago down to St. Louis. St. Louis crossed over through Kansas City. Kansas City, long drive up to Denver. Went to my mom and Jim's house up in Longmont. Left Isabella there. And then Florencia and I drove back via Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, Reno, San Francisco. And who's the family on this trip? It's me, Tim Amyx. At the time in 2010, I was 49 years old. Florencia would have been 46, 47 years old. And the girls, Nicole had just gotten her driver's license. Nicole was 16 and Isabella would have been 13. So now let's take a look with some commentary that I will give you some behind the scenes anecdotes that you did not see before. Here we begin. This is the three of us in Los Angeles, where our East Coast bound flight rerouted. Took a plane ride from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. And this, as I mentioned, I will mention numerous times, is June through July 2010. This was the 5th year we were doing our Amyx Gascon family road trips, and this is the first one where we actually did not camp. We took the plane cross-country, landed here we are on the Dulles International Airport, which is in Washington, D.C., and purchased a car. There's our 2010 blue Prius. We had pre-ordered it, so it was waiting for us there at the Alexandria dealer, and they actually even put on the Yakima rack. So we ordered all of that to be done while it was waiting for us. First thing we did, once we got our car, was went downtown towards the monuments and across the Potomac River. Here we are in the Arlington National Cemetery. So the Arlington National Cemetery was at one time the home of Robert Lee, the top general for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And there you can see the Washington Monument in the background, and there is the Lincoln Monument on the other side of the Potomac River. One of the grave sites at the Arlington National Monument Cemetery is the grave of John Kennedy the president. And then here is the Jefferson Memorial, dedicated to Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States. This is all part of our first day tour, even before we checked into our motel. In the afternoon, we did check into the Palomar Motel, which is on the north side of town. And don't get too excited, Isabella, you're not going to get to keep that robe. Florencia won us a free 2-night stay in the Palomar Hotel due to a contest they had at her school a couple years before. The day after we spent our first night in Washington, D.C., we hopped on the subway, and this is going to be the first of many subways and trains that we took during this cross-country tour. We'll take them in Boston and New York. Oh, so let's jump ahead. So Lynn Woolsey. Lynn Woolsey was our congresswoman at the time for Marin County. And we were told ahead of time, if you're going to go to Washington, D.C., contact your local congressman, congresswoman, and they will set you up with a free tour. So we did. and our guide was there waiting for us. We were on a list with our name ready to go, and I can't remember this fellow's name, but I do remember that he was a TAM graduate. Among the many things we saw, one of the most memorable was going up in the rotunda, and here we see famous paintings by the artists John Trumbull, William Powell, and John Chapman. So this was probably in the middle part, maybe towards the back end after we had seen, is that us there at the Supreme Court? That might be us in the Supreme Court, which is part of the tour as well. Ah, it is. There we are walking down the stairs outside the Supreme Court. After we took the tour of the tour with the tour guide, we walked around the mall. We were going to go up in this, which is the Washington Monument, tall tower. There's an elevator that goes up there. And we could not get tickets. We couldn't get tickets for the day after, which was the only time we were going to have to do it. The Air and Space Museum I had been to 2 times before, so this is the 3rd time that I went to it, and wow, did I love going to this. This was a fantastic museum. It has, that's a replica of the Kitty Hawk Wright brothers. There is Chuck Yeager's jet that broke the sound barrier. And is that the Spirit of St. Louis? Yeah, that's the Spirit of St. Louis, the first plane that crossed the Atlantic. Mercury 7, this is Alan Shepard's spaceship. On the other side of the mall, this was the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And this was pretty cool. This basically was a tour of American history. Well, after going to our motel, taking showers, we went back out on the town and went for a walk around the monuments, in particular to see the Abraham Lincoln Monument at night. After a 2-day stay in Washington, D.C., we crossed the Potomac River and then went down into Virginia. Throughout this road trip, there were many places we did not get to see in detail. Mount Vernon here, just on the other side of the south side of Washington, D.C., one time home of George Washington. We did have a chance to actually pose outside and see the entrance, but we did not get to go inside. Just an hour or 2 south of Mount Vernon is Monticello, which this is Thomas Jefferson's home, also in Virginia. And also we did not have time or take the expense to enter the Monticello exhibit. Just after Monticello, we headed east. You can see the sunset, and spent the night in Stanton, Virginia. The next day, we entered Shenandoah National Park. As far as national parks go, we're kind of jaded by all the great parks we see on the West Coast, and we kind of thought of it as like I guess this is okay. For the East Coast people, they got to have something. So what is Shenandoah National Park? It's rather large, and it has a lot of tourist historic buildings. We stopped in this lunch cafeteria and watched Mexico get eliminated by Argentina in the Men's World Cup. As we were about to exit the park, Florencia stopped at an area not far from the exit, ran over by a tree to take a pee, and this is what she saw. A black bear. We don't too often see the black bears when we're in the mountains and the Sierras, but sure enough, we saw one in Shenandoah National Park. After the Shenandoah National Park, we headed through West Virginia and then back into Virginia again, and then Maryland and in Pennsylvania, and we stopped at least for a sign, a picture of this sign, the Harper's Ferry. We did not have time to go see any of the sites, in particular where John Brown famously raided the Federal Army. Gettysburg was the main stop for today, but you have to know the story behind what we almost did not do. We almost did not take a tour through Gettysburg because Nicole and Isabella, when they found out we were going to take a bus ride that was going to be 2 to 3 hours long, they almost mutinied and said, there's no way we're going on this bus ride. Long story short, I pretty much twisted their arm and bribed them with God knows what. I said, we are taking this bus ride to see the Gettysburg National Historic Monument. And we did, and they loved it. It was a terrific tour, and the guide was fantastic. I'm guessing that all the guides are really good. They're knowledgeable, they're passionate, they're animated, and this guy was really good. The drive went through numerous sites and battles. We got out of the bus a couple of times. This is Little Round Top, which is one of the well-known locations overlooking the base area of Gettysburg. After we took the tour, the same day we headed towards Pennsylvania, headed towards Philadelphia took a stop at the Hershey's chocolate factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and took what really was a rather lame tour through the chocolate factory. It was a tour that was designed exclusively for tourists. None of this that you see is actually machines in work making chocolate. So it's all staged, kind of like a ride in Disneyland, more than actually a factory. Here we are driving through the Amish Mennonite community in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this is on our way to Berwyn, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the Mintzes. And there is Jessica, Ron, and Sophie Mintz, our friends from California who moved to Philadelphia a few years back. The morning after, Florencia and I drove over to Valley Forge and did, of course, a run. We ran around the perimeter of what is a replica of the fort. And after breakfast, we hopped on a train, and it was probably about a 30-minute train ride into Philadelphia from the Mintz's house. Philadelphia, known as the city of brotherly love. This here is this is Independence Hall, which is across the street from the Liberty Bell. And Independence Hall was where the delegates met in 1776 and decided to proclaim independence from England. This here is a group of Haitian tourists doing a recreation of the Rocky dance, the Rocky jump at the top of the steps at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Seemed to be a popular thing for tourists to do, and Nicole and Isabella did it as well. At the base of the steps, there's of all things, surprise, surprise, there's a statue of Sylvester Stallone in his Rocky stand. We had lunch at the Corner Bakery, downtown Philadelphia, and that pretty much wrapped up our stay in Philadelphia. After departing Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we drove north and simply drove through Delaware long enough to take a picture by their state entrance and drove straight into New York. New York was one of our big stays. We were here for 3 days and stayed at the Crown Plaza, which is not far from Flushing Meadows. Here's the Brooklyn Bridge as we are entering. This is the subway station not far from our motel, and the 3 days we were here, each day we hopped on the subway here and went down into Manhattan, and once we were downtown Manhattan, veered off to different parts of New York to see the famous landmarks of the city. While we were on the subway, we ironically had no incidents of cuckoo people talking to us, dancing, singing, or threatening us. The first day we took a driving bus tour. Here we are going through Harlem, the famous Apollo Theater. It was fun to be on top of this bus, and the weather this day was probably close to 100 degrees. It was about 100 degrees most of the first week we were on the East Coast. I believe that's looking up at the Empire State Building, and later on a walk through Central Park. I do recall how hot it was. It was pretty close to 100 degrees. Only 95 degrees at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. We hopped on a carriage thanks to Grandma Marietta, who before we went to New York gave us $30 and said, here is $30, you have to take a carriage ride through New York. This is not to be used for anything else. So thanks to Grandma Marietta, we got to take a carriage ride. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Nicole walked up the stairs there, and then Nicole crossed the street over by where Macaulay Culkin stayed at Home Alone, which is the Plaza Motel. A few blocks around the corner is the Dillon's Candy Store, which Isabella said, the Drake said we have to go to the Dillon's Candy Store. So we went to the candy store, and while we were there, got kicked out by a group of filmmakers that were filming an episode of Being the Kardashians. After Dillon's Candy, we took a bus down to the tip of Manhattan, hopped on a ferry, and went over to, I believe it's called Liberty Island, and had a tour. We didn't take a tour, but we walked into the Statue of Liberty. We did not walk up into the top of it. I can't remember why we didn't walk up to the top, but we did not walk into the top of the statue. Continuing the trip on our final day, day 3, we took more of a walking tour, and on this day we went through NBC Rockefeller Center Here we saw Grand Central Station, where the crowd was watching a soccer game. The World Cup was continuing, and we saw a soccer game being broadcast down in the train station. Up at Times Square, you can see behind us, the news of the day is run across that, what do you call that, a ticket tape digital sign. Radio City Music Hall was all part of the tour this day. Did not see a show of Mamma Mia, but had a real nice walking tour through New York into the evening. I think this is July 4th, and this is the night that Justin Bieber was going to be performing. And reasons that we regret to this day, we did not go, didn't want to get involved with the crowds, the heat, so we went and just stayed in our motel on the night of July 4th instead of watching Justin Bieber in a free live concert over on the Hudson River. After 3 full days, we got back in the car and drove north into and actually through Connecticut, stopped briefly at the state capital, which is Hartford, Connecticut, and continued the drive up into Rhode Island. And Providence, another state capital, was going to be our destination. We were going to spend the night in Providence, Rhode Island. Oh, there's my new driver, filling up with gas. Thank you, Nicole. Nicole turned 16 on this trip, and this was the first year where she was actually a driver part-time on some of the connections. So here we are at a sign outside of Rhode Island. During a walking tour, this is Brown University. We didn't quite bump into, but we saw in the distance, a classmate of Nicole's, Phoebe Miller and her mom. They were apparently taking a tour of Brown University the same day. There they are, way in the background with that group. We didn't connect and say hello for some reason. After a night's stay in Providence, Rhode Island, we hopped on a ferry in a town called Falmouth, Massachusetts. Falmouth, Massachusetts, hopped on a ferry, went across to Martha's Vineyard, the island, the playground island for the rich and famous. And our hosts here were Steve and Iris Katz, our Marin County running friends who have a summer home there. And there's Steve telling us about the sights. Edgartown, which is famous if you know a little bit about the incident of Chappaquiddick and Ted Kennedy. And this is the same boat that was filmed on the movie Jaws, where there was this wonderful shot of Murray Hamilton and Roy Scheider talking as the barge went from one part of the island to the other. These are all sections that were used in the filming of Jaws. The final day we were there, Steve Katz said the thing to do is go to a local fishery, buy crab and corn on the cob, and go watch the sunset and eat crab. So that's what we did. The day after, we did a swim in Toby's Pond, and this was the day before we left. Quick cut, and here we are now. We are immediately, this is the Charles River. This is the Charles River in Boston. We did this, I believe, our first day of Boston before we went downtown and toured the historic sites. Lexington is a town where Paul Revere stopped on his midnight ride to Concord. And the next day after that was one of the first battles of the American Revolution. So we stopped here as we were driving up the Battle Road Freedom Highway heading towards the North Bridge. We stopped here, walked across the North Bridge, went and visited the Visitor Center, and the girls got their first taste of some history of the American Revolution. This is our very nice motel that we had on the far eastern side of town. We were probably a good half hour outside of downtown. And we were watching here the finals of the World Cup. In this, Spain beat Holland in the finals. The next day was July 8th, 2010, and we rode the train into Boston, and this was one of our most memorable days. We did so many things in Boston, a town we'd never seen before. First and foremost was a ride on the Duck Tour, a part boat, part shuttle, part bus that drove us around town and showed us the sights of Boston. The Boston Common, went into the Charles River, and this was probably one of the most memorable moments of the entire trip, when this massive storm, a huge lightning storm, hit us when we were on the boat. People in the back of the boat got drenched. We were underneath a canopy, an awning, so we did not get wet, but boy did it pour. After the duck tour, we did the walking tour of Boston, the Freedom Trail. There's Paul Revere's statue in the Commons. Some of the typical things we saw the corner bookstore, we saw Faneuil Hall, there's Paul Revere's grave in a cemetery, there's a look in the background of the old State House, Paul Revere's Church, Fenway Park, where Cheers supposedly takes place, and St. Elsewhere, the St. Elsewhere Hospital where St. Elsewhere is supposed to take place. Jumping up, so we're outside of Boston, heading north, and now we're into Plymouth, Massachusetts, where this replica of the Mayflower was, and just next to a replica of the Mayflower, which we did not go on, is Plymouth Rock. There's the rock from Plymouth Rock, the symbolic rock where the Pilgrims landed in 1620. Continuing northbound towards the far northeastern side of the country is the state of Maine. And the farther Arcadia Park, the farthest eastern park in the United States. And here we are at the top of Cadillac Mountain, which is their version of a big mountain on the East Coast. Better part of the day, we then hopped on a couple of they weren't tour buses, they were interpark buses, went to the beach, went to the coast, and you can see it is a beautiful coastal line, not unlike something you might see on the coast of Northern California. While we were there, Isabella and Nicole continued their juggling. As I recall, Isabella was told by her coach that she had to learn to be able to juggle 100 straight kicks, 100 straight juggles, if she wanted to have the opportunity to start the following year. Here's my new driver. Thank you, Nicole, driving for the family on road trip. That's me enjoying my quiet time reading the maps. The Bates Motel in the town of Ellsworth, Arcadia. Probably the spookiest, dirtiest, ugliest, most disgusting motel we had stayed at on any road trip. To this day, we look at that as probably the worst motel we've ever stayed at. Leaving Maine, we headed westbound through the states of Vermont and New Hampshire and New York. First, we went through New Hampshire, and this is not Mexico. As in Mexico, there was a town called Mexico in New Hampshire. Our destination for this evening was going to be Manipule, Vermont. We went through another town called Lancaster. There was a Lancaster in Pennsylvania. There was a Lancaster in California. And then we went through the Lancaster in New Hampshire. There we are crossing the river, and now we're into Vermont. 2 stops we did in Vermont. We stopped and took a picture by a big maple syrup sign, and also took a tour through the Ben & Jerry's ice cream plant. This was only slightly better than the lame tour of the Hershey plant. Not nearly as good as, say, the tour we had of the Boeing plant in Everett, Washington, a year or two later. We did cross a few of the bridges in Vermont. I had a little map that said bridges you can cross in Vermont. So we took the opportunity to drive through a few, and that's me putting the camera on a tripod and driving through. The next day was a big driving tour. We'd go through the entire state of New York, which included a stop in the middle of the day in Cooperstown to go through the Baseball Hall of Fame. As we were driving towards Cooperstown, a big storm hit, and this big storm only got bigger after we exited the Hall of Fame. So fortunately, the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown was an area I was able to talk the girls into going through for at least a couple hours. They went in for, 2 hours, and then went out and walked around Cooperstown. I said, okay, give me 2 more hours here on my own, and I'll meet you guys after, and then we'll call it a day, and then we'll drive to our next destination, which was going to be Utica, New York. Oh, we had a fun stay in the baseball museum, watching Abbott and Costello do their Who's on First, and then a nice walk through the hall where all the inductees had their plaques, including the statue of Babe Ruth. Oh, and Buck O'Neill. After we exited the Hall of Fame, a storm hit, and it was dark, and we drove in this massive storm from Cooperstown to Utica, and it rained so hard, and lightning was so hard that we had to stop a couple of times just to park off the side of the road because we couldn't see anything, and we were concerned we were going to get hit by lightning. So after a night's stay in Utica, we drove up, crossed the border into Canada and went to Niagara Falls, the famous Niagara Falls, which are actually on the border between the United States and Canada, but we crossed into the northern side of the border into Canada, which is where our hotel was, and had these spectacular looks of Niagara Falls. I'd have to say Niagara Falls was probably one of the great wonders that we saw on this road trip. Could easily be a national park. It is really cool. Looking down there, we see a group of people on a boat with their blue life preservers, and we thought, well, what kind of fool would get on a boat and go under the waterfall? Well, we would. There's a look over there on the north side of the falls. So yeah, we walked down and we got our blue vests and we got on the Maid of the Mist and rode under, not quite under the falls, that would be an exaggeration to say we drove under the falls, but you drive pretty close and you do get drenched. It's not called Made of Mist without good reason. Again, one of the most memorable stays, stops, and things we did see on this 39-day trip. Later that evening, from our hotel, which was a few blocks away, we walked back and had a night look of the falls with, oh, look at that, a fireworks show. A day after the stay in Niagara Falls, we drove into Canada and into the province of Ontario. Here we were going to spend the night, one night in Toronto. Toronto, Ontario. I didn't realize it until the next morning, but our hotel was right next door to the old Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, Maple Leaf Garden. We were right next to a place called the Maple Leaf Garden, which had been shut down 11 years before, so there was nothing to see except the fact that there it was right next to our hotel, and I thought that was kind of cool. We took a big walking tour of Toronto. It was busy, and it was hot. And one of my biggest surprises that I saw here, and this is one of my big regrets, the National Hockey League Hall of Fame is in Toronto, in downtown Toronto. I had no idea it was even there. Of course, we were in the middle of a walking tour, didn't have the time, and I didn't want to spend $20 to go in for only 20 minutes, so walked right by the Hall of Fame. One of my great regrets on the walking tour. Tim and Florencia, right below, guess what? A maple leaf tree, which apparently is the tree of Toronto, or this region of Canada. I was able to talk Isabella into going around and up on that bridge for a photo. I said, Isabella, would you run up there for a photo? She said, okay, boom, 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 boom. And there she went. Our day after Toronto, we were back on the road, heading back into the USA. We crossed into Michigan and went kind of around the outskirts of Detroit, not through Detroit, and we crossed what was called the Blue Water Bridge at Lake Huron. This took us down into Ohio, where we would spend one night in Toledo, as the next day we would continue our trip towards Chicago. Out of Ohio into Indiana, and in Indiana, of course, is South Bend, and we drove through the town of South Bend, which was the home of Notre Dame University. Did not have the time to stop at Notre Dame. Put that on the top 10 of regrets I wish we could have done. I wish we could have driven through Notre Dame and seen what the campus looks like. There in the distance is the Sears Tower, and on our left side was the stadium where the White Sox play. In 2010, it was called Cellular Field. Now it's called Guaranteed Field, and many years ago it was referred to as Comiskey Park. In Chicago, we had the opportunity to, of all things, see a movie being filmed. This was the day we got here, and as we were crossing one of the rivers, we noticed all these odd structures that looked like futuristic robots and cars and Transformers. Because guess what? They were filming Transformers here, right next to a corner bakery. And so we thought, well, if we go into the corner bakery, maybe we can watch them film while we get something to eat and drink, which is what we did. And we saw in the distance, we saw some of the actors from the movie, and we also saw my old friend Michael Bay, who was the director of Transformers. I say friend, well, the fellow who I worked with on The Rock. The girls were looking for Shia LaBeouf, and I think they actually did see Shia LaBeouf at one time. Our hotel was in Evanston on the north side of downtown, and we took the L train downtown, and we were planning a riverboat, a boardwalk tour, and stop by for some photographs of Wrigley Field, where the Cubs have been playing since 1914. And Jim Slocum told us we had to go to this pizza parlor downtown. He said it's the greatest thick crust pizza you will ever have. Well, it was all right. After the pizza, we hopped on a taxi. This is a boat taxi, which is a lot cheaper than actually paying for tours. So we pretended we were taxi, as did most people on this. They got on the taxi, and instead of getting off at the stops where you could have, we stayed on it for all the stops we possibly could. After our ride on the boat taxi, we went across the street to the Navy Pier. And the Navy Pier is a historic area of Chicago just on the edge of the water, kind of like Pier 39 in San Francisco, in that it's now primarily for tourists. The Navy actually opened the pier in 1916, and it was called Municipal Pier. It was renamed Navy Pier in 1927 to honor the sailors from World War I. And by 1995, it was redone into what it is now known as today as the Navy Pier, where tourists come and ride the Ferris wheel. The day after our trip to Navy Pier in Chicago, we dropped off Nicole at the Chicago airport. Florencia, Nicole, and I drove down to St. Louis. And St. Louis was our next destination that night. And we did a small walking tour at the base of the arch. And at the base of the arch, we discovered there was a museum, which was a really cool museum, as more of an exhibit of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which began here in St. Louis in 1804, and it was their return destination in 1806. We had to talk Isabella into going up in the arch because she was, quite frankly, petrified of the idea of going inside of the arch. Again, with a little bit of coercing and bribery, we did get her in, and it was quite claustrophobic going up in that arch. And it kind of goes sideways because the arch is not as straight up and down. Once we got out and looked out the little teeny windows, we can see on one side, the north side, is the old courthouse, which is part of the National Historic Parks. Next to that is Bush Memorial Stadium, and this is where the St. Louis Rams were playing at the time, and also the baseball Cardinals. On the other side of the river, on the other side of the arch, on the east side, you can see the Mississippi River. Back on the road, we have our gas attendant, Isabella, doing her usual duty. She drew her name in the mud, and that mud stayed with us all the way until California. After leaving St. Louis, we drove towards Kansas City, and we stopped at this overlook of the Missouri River, which was an area that had a interpretive sign of where Lewis and Clark passed through here in 1804. In Kansas City, Florencia got a nice picture of where the Chiefs play, Arrowhead Stadium where the Chiefs play football, and also where the Kansas City Royals play baseball. In Kansas City, we weren't here long. We were here long enough to enjoy another big storm and have some ribs at Kansas City Jack's Ribs in downtown Kansas City, where it did pour. Jack Fiorilla's Jack Stack's Barbecue. After spending lunch in Kansas City, we drove halfway through Kansas and stayed at a town called Hays, Kansas for the night. And this was going to be our last night on the road before we stopped at Colorado to visit Grandma and Grandpa. The next day was a full day drive through Kansas where it was flat, and then to Colorado, where our destination was going to be Longmont, to spend a few days with Grandma Marietta and Grandpa Jim, driving through the flatlands, exiting Kansas, and entering Colorado. This was a nice roadside rest just on the inside of Colorado as we crossed the border, explaining the history of the state of Colorado. Drove through Denver, didn't stop in Denver, but there we are in Longmont, California, visiting Grandma and Grandpa. While we were in Longmont, we did the usual walk around the river ponds, and later in the evening, played another round of Rummy Cup. This later became one of Grandma Marietta's favorite board games. Another family tradition we have when we're with Grandma is to make homemade pasta. She usually likes to do this with the girls. While we were in Longmont, we took a day trip down to Boulder, Colorado, and spent one day there walking downtown with Grandpa Chet and Grandma Guyla, who happened to be in Denver visiting Guyla's daughter, Kristen. And here they came up with Audrey, got his granddaughter Audrey, as well as her son-in-law Steve and her grandson Braden. Check it out, my flip cell phone. Moving on west, Isabella stayed in Longmont to spend a few extra days with Grandma, and she was going to fly back to California. So just Florencia and I drove back on our own from Longmont through Wyoming and down into Utah, and then we were going to head through Nevada and into California. This is the Lincoln Highway, where there's a nice statue of Abe Lincoln commemorating the highway to Abe. While driving through Wyoming, we went through the Wind River Mountains, which you can see in the background. We also drove through the towns of Rawlins, Rock Springs, and Green River. On the south side of Wyoming is Fort Bridger, not far from South Pass. And it's here where we stopped at Fort Bridger State Park. This was named after the mountain man Jim Bridger, and this later became a trading fort. And it was also a recreation of the well-known fort, where also the Pony Express, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the California Trail all went through this location. And this stop was kind of like their roadside rest when they were taking their road trips on those western-bound trips. Continuing the same day, we went through Utah with a stop at the Echo Rest Stop. And this is just on the east side of Salt Lake City. We didn't stop in Salt Lake City. We drove through Salt Lake City and continued westbound on I-80 through the flat dry lands of Utah and into Nevada. This area here near Wendover, Utah is called the Bonneville Salt Flats, and they began testing automobiles here in 1912, and by the 1930s they were using it to compete for land speed records. Entering into Nevada on our way to Reno. And here we are at the Grand Sierra Resort, where we spent the night before heading back to California. Look at our Prius. Isabella's name is still there. Our memories of Isabella are coming back from, where did she do that? I think in Kansas or St. Louis, before Denver. Back into California, and this was our final day of the road trip. This would have been day 39 of the 2010 road trip, and this took us all the way back to California. 514 Browning Court, back home. Oh, where's Florencia? She was not in for this recreation of my arrival. And we're back. Thanks for taking the road trip with us and learning a little bit more about the Amyx Gascon family and their travels on the Cross Country 2010 road trip. Quick look at what the family looks like now, 13 years later. Here's me on this year's road trip. Here's Florencia on this last summer road trip. Here's Nicole and Isabella on this last summer road trip, which they took with their boyfriends and husband. And one final shout out to Robin Barstow, who was my inspiration on these behind the scenes videos when he made home movies in the 1950s and put them all up on the internet. Salute to Robin Barstow. See you on the next road trip video.